Noruega. Eu ia passar agora a palavra ao professor Mike Orbach, que é professor de Assuntos Marítimos e Políticas de Mar na Universidade, na Duke University, na famosa Universidade Duke University, nos Estados Unidos da América. O professor Orbach desenvolveu trabalhos em todas as costas da América do Norte e da América Central, incluindo México, Caraíbas. Desenvolveu também trabalhos no Sudoeste Asiático e na Europa. Principalmente, e julgo que isto é o que também nos importa, foi consultor para a Pew Ocean Commission e para a US Commission on Oceans, que foram duas organizações que eu referi aqui na minha introdução, como tendo sido fundamentais para também trazer os Estados Unidos da América para uma perspectiva integrada dos oceanos. Tenho tido o prazer de trabalhar junto com Mike Orbach no projeto CALAMAR e também em trabalhos da Fundação Luso-Americana para o Desenvolvimento e, portanto, estou certo que vai ser muito interessante ouvir o professor Mike Orbach a falar-nos sobre a visão americana para o Oceano Atlântico e as relações transatlânticas entre os Estados Unidos, a Europa e Portugal também, em particular. Por favor, Sr. Professor.
Thank you, Tiago. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Lisbon talking about this topic. I began my maritime career in San Diego, California, fishing with a fisherman from Portugal, tuna fishermen on 80-meter-long seiners, 1,200-ton capacity tuna seiners, fishing all over the eastern Pacific, and all my crew members and friends were people with names such as Silva and Souza and Correa and Cabral, and I can tell you they were fine fishermen, fine seamen, and perhaps most important of all for the topic of this conference, they were fine entrepreneurs. They owned not only the 80-meter tuna seiners that they fished on, but they owned the shipyards that built those tuna seiners, and they owned the canneries that canned the tuna when they got back. They truly built the industry, the Portuguese community in San Diego, and it was that combination of their history with the sea, but their business acumen and their strength as a community that built that industry. And I think that's the combination that it's going to take to move us ahead on the topic we have today. I'm going to make 3 points today. The first is just to make you aware of the project that Tiago mentioned called the CALAMAR project, which was a U.S.-European Union dialogue on marine policy that covered many of the topics we have talked about today. The second is to review a bit of history on how conversations such as the ones we're having have gone over the last several hundred years. And then finally to make a few points about where we might be going in the future. The CALAMAR project, Cooperation Across the Atlantic for Marine Governance Integration, was funded by the European Union. The principal contractor was a group called the Ecologic Institute out of Berlin. And the way it worked was to get a few dozen people together who were from the EU and the US and start a focused dialogue on topics of relevance to marine policy, and we ended up focusing primarily on the North Atlantic. The larger group had 4 working groups: oceans and climate change, high seas, that is issues that occur outside the 200-mile EEZs in the so-called ABNJ, areas beyond national jurisdiction. Integrated maritime policies and tools. You've heard a lot about integration and the lack of integration today. And then finally, EU-US transatlantic cooperation on specific issues such as fishing and shipping. I do not have the time to go into the results of that report. There were some 50 recommendations about how to move forward on that dialogue in particular between the U.S. And by the way, many of us protested this project because we said it should not be the U.S. and the EU. It should be the U.S., Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and the EU. But the EU rules would only let us fund people from the United States. So the next step is to bring everyone else in, as you have in this meeting, which is very nice. The final report is available on the web. You see oh, that's hard to see, isn't it? The website here, but I can get it to you if you, or if you just Google CALAMAR. That's the easy way these days. Google CALAMAR. You can find the results of that report. It's always useful to me to look at history of conversations because we tend to do things over and over again. That's the human way. If we go back to the time when your country was the preeminent country in ocean affairs in the 15 and 1600s, it was primarily about commerce. It was primarily about military dominance, and even though Portugal, your country, and Spain tried to claim the entire ocean in 1599 in the Treaty of Tordesillas, we forgive you for that. It was a long time ago. It turns out you couldn't enforce that, so it kind of went by the wayside. And if we jump forward to the world wars in the Atlantic, you see one of the first kinds of relationships that really are important over time develop. And I point here to the Azores. As I'm sure most of you know, the United States has a significant military presence in the Azores resulting from the wars. And that has become a durable relationship. And I think in all of our discussions of ocean policy, we need to include the military, of course. It's a very important aspect of everything that happens on the ocean. But it also spawned a lot of other kinds of cooperation. For example, the Luso-American Foundation that was created out of the negotiations on that base after the war continues today to be an important supporter of these conversations on ocean policy, not just in Portugal, but or even just between Portugal and the U.S., but maritime discussions generally. So different kinds of relationships, military, shipping, commerce, can lead to other kinds of relationships in areas of management and policy as well. And that relationship between the U.S. and Portugal got more full after the Second War. Now, one of the points I want to make, and I think it's relevant to the exercise with the Marine Strategy Directive, the new plan that we're talking about today, is that none of this is easy and none of this happens quickly. So if you look back at the Law of the Sea negotiations, which actually the first convention started back in 1958, you remember there, those of you who are old enough to remember this, there were two original ones in 58 and 60, Law of the Sea 1 and 2, didn't really go much of anywhere. And the one we remember today is the third convention on the Law of the Sea, which started in 1973. But that convention went for 9 years and didn't produce a document that was open for signature until 1982. And in fact, the treaty was not considered in force, having gathered enough signatures, until almost over a dozen years later. So these things take a great deal of time when they're broadly international, and the Law of the Sea Conference was a good example of that. Now, when we start to talk about the 21st century here, I go to some of the activities that Tiago mentioned. In the United States, back in the 1960s, we had something called the Stratton Commission, which produced a report called Our Nation in the Sea. It was the first comprehensive look the United States has done about all ocean policies. Out of it came our federal agency, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Coastal Management Program. A lot of things that you see in the U.S. today came out of the Stratton Commission report in the 1960s. Now, things moved fast, and in the 70s and 80s, people got more concerned about conservation and the environment, and a number of us lobbied literally for 30 years to have another comprehensive look. And it took 30 years for that to happen in the United States. And the way it happened, you see I listed here the U.S. Ocean Commission, and there were actually two, and the Pew Ocean Commission that Tiago had mentioned. What's interesting about that is that we were trying to lobby the U.S. Congress to start a second Ocean Commission to have a new comprehensive look, and they wouldn't do it. So finally, the Pew Charitable Trust, a private philanthropic group in the United States, funded their own and got it together, and it embarrassed our Congress so much that our Congress created the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy. My point there is that sometimes it's not the government that takes the initiative, it's a private group that takes the initiative that stimulates a great deal of activity. Again, pointing to that industry-government relationship. So we did have those two commission reports. They ended up saying about the same thing that came out in the early 2000s. And the problem now is that you have to implement whatever you say in your plan. You have to get into action. You have to have legislation. You have to have regulations. You have to have private industry stepping up with their own incentive programs. That has really not happened too much in the United States because of our current political situation, although both the Bush and the Obama administrations have done some activity, and I have to say Mr. Obama has been very proactive on this, because of the difficult political situation in the United States, especially in our Congress these days. We're really not implementing those recommendations out of those reports very much. In fact, there's very active opposition to some of that. So in the end, it's all political, and persistence is the virtue. It takes years, if not decades, and you have to operate at many different levels in many different places. Now, I am very pleased to be working in Portugal because you folks are taking initiatives these days, whether it's your continental shelf issues with the Azores or meetings such as this. You are really the leaders now in looking at these kinds of issues and questions. And in the end, as always, it will be persistence over time that will matter. So if we look into the future, I would say there are three things really to keep in mind. The first one concerns the very real and forward-thinking activity that you are attempting to generate here with this plan, and Portugal's prominent role in that. That's incredibly important. It's incredibly foresightful and forward-thinking and visionary, but it's going to take incredible persistence, and it's not going to happen fast. And I think many of you in the room know this. Think decades, not years, right, for getting most of this done, if not implemented. In the U.S., we are going to continue to keep pressing. We hope that some of the political constraints will change in the next couple of years that will allow us to move forward. That's most likely to be in two areas. One is regional ocean councils that will cross the land-sea boundary in this new term ecosystem management in the U.S., and those are already formulated in concept, but they have to be funded. And then this question of marine spatial planning, where again, you in Europe are much farther ahead of us, having done this in the North Sea, in Belgium, and other places in a much more comprehensive way than we have done it yet. So you are the model for us. We will hopefully get to this in the next decade or so. But the final point I want to make is that in the end, I think our objective is what I call the policy enclosure of the world ocean. And by that I mean, 60% of the world ocean is outside areas of national jurisdiction. It's the last frontier on this planet. I think we need to say to ourselves, we know enough about the ocean to say that everything that is done out there needs to be done under some guidance, some supervision, some oversight. We have the ability to do this, and so whatever happens on the ocean, including the areas beyond natural jurisdiction, it should be subject to some oversight regime that has clear objectives, that has enforceable rules, and that is aimed towards sustainability of ocean resources. We are going to use the ocean more fully, and we are in the position to put effective guidance in place before we start those major uses. And I think that's what we ought to do for the entire ocean. Now, the North Atlantic and the Atlantic generally is a great place to start that. And I look forward to working with you on that endeavor. Obrigado.